This lesson is going to take a look at where the Enlightenment failed. So, over the last few weeks, we've talked about some of the big and important advancements that took place in Western Europe during what was known as the Age of Reason or the Age of Enlightenment. And we're shifting from an old way of thinking to a new way of thinking, where there is going to be more logic being used, where people are going to look more scientifically at the world around them to better understand the world in order to make the world a better place, in order to improve human lives. So we're looking at science over superstition. And this is going to result in some pretty amazing advancements and amazing discoveries that are going to help us to better understand our world and to hopefully advance and make things better. But there are some things about the Enlightenment that we need to know about. What did the Enlightenment say about race? What did it say about gender? And these are the areas where the Enlightenment is going to be a bit less enlightened and sort of fall victim to some bad science and some bad logic. So we need a little context here. As we look at history, we want to make sure we understand when things are happening and how those might influence the way people think and the decisions that they make. So if we think about contextually, the Enlightenment's going to take place in the 15 to 16 and into the 1700s. By the mid-1400s, if we think about what's happening in other parts of the world, we know that the African slave trade is beginning. It's going to start slow as slaves are being traded throughout the continent and into other parts near Africa. But as shipping improves and as ship designs improve and as ships go farther and as people begin to explore other parts of the world, by 1503, African slaves are going to be sent off to Americas. Now, put that into context with what we've learned about. Galileo was born in 1564, so he's being born into a European community that has already been engaged in the slave trade for the better part of 60 years. So as European colonization expands and as Europe begins to establish colonies in the Americas, predominantly Spain and Portugal in South and Central America and in the Caribbean, the slave trade is going to expand as well. And that's kind of important as we consider what European philosophers are going to say about race. So contextually, these philosophers and enlightened people are living in an age where slavery is a reality, and obviously race is going to play a factor in that. We're also going to talk about racism and prejudice, not just about people of African descent, but also people who were Jewish. Racism and prejudice against people who were Jewish was something that had been a long standard in Europe. Jewish ghettos, which were segregated neighborhoods, were established as early as 1179 in many Eastern European cities. We looked at the Black Death and the Black Plague earlier this year, and in 1349, Jews were rounded up and were burned alive because they were being blamed for the Black Death, that their religious beliefs and their lifestyle was somehow contributing to this plague that was killing off so many people. And in places like Frankfurt, which is in modern-day Germany, in 1615, there was a plundering of Jewish ghettos, and this is something that takes place commonly in many different parts of Europe, especially Eastern Europe, where you have Jewish neighborhoods being ransacked by people, pogroms, violent attacks against people who are Jewish. So racism and prejudice are not anything that is new in Europe. It's been there for a very, very long time. So if we think about what the Enlightenment is actually trying to accomplish, scientists and thinkers are trying to classify the world. As we try to look and better understand the world, in order to understand it, we need to give things names and give things labels and try to be able to identify things, kind of standardize what we see about the world. And this becomes very dangerous because these quote-unquote scientists are going to start to apply these scientific labels to people. One of the men we need to look at here is this gentleman, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. And he's going to write a book called On the Natural Varieties of Mankind, which is going to be published in 1776, a year that should kind of stand out, right? Declaration of Independence, the American Revolution is going on. And he asks this question in his book, are men and have men of all times and of every race been one and the same, or clearly more than one species? So the question is, where did people come from? Are we all of the same species? Did we evolve together? Are we separate species? So this is sort of his hypothesis. Where did people come from? Obviously, people look different. We have different features, skin color, eyes and hair. Where did all that come from? So he was a German anthropologist. So he studied humans. He studied human remains. He studied human skeletons. And he decides that he is going to, based on his study of these skeletons, rank people based on what he determines their skeletons to say. Like, he uses that as the basis of his ranking of people from different parts of the world. And he creates 5 different categories of people and races. And in a way that's okay, but then what he does is he creates a hierarchy. He ranks them. And we'll come back to that here in a second. So the 5 races he determined are the Caucasian race, from people from Europe, Mongolian from Asia, Malay from Southeast Asia, Negro from Africa, and American Indian from America, Native American Indians, right? So then he then does sort of the worst thing he could do, which is he ranks them. He creates this racial hierarchy. When you put things in order or you rank things, what you're doing is you're giving them value. You're emphasizing the differences between people. You're not looking at similarities. You're not identifying shared values and shared commonalities. What you're doing is you're dividing them. You're creating value in one group over another. So based on his list, and of course, as a European, it's not really surprising he would put them at the top. You have the Caucasian at the top, the American Indian at the bottom. You're giving one value over the other. And this becomes very, very dangerous, because what you're doing is you're classifying people, you're dividing people, and you're giving those differences values, either positive or negative values. And that's really, really pretty terrible. Blumenbach says that Caucasians were, quote, considered as the primate or intermediate of these 5 principal races. Basically the primate, the number one, the best one. And that other races were, quote, a degeneration from the original type. So according to his science, and again, this is not very good science, he's saying that the Caucasian race was the best, and that all races were beneath them. They were a degeneration. Also from his book, he says, quote, in the first place, that stock displays the most beautiful form of the skull, from which, as from a mean and primeval type, the others diverge by most easy gradations. Besides, it is white in color, which we may fairly assume to have been the primitive color of mankind, since it is very easy for that to degenerate into brown, but very much more difficult for dark to become white. So again, he's playing with this idea of giving value to people based on the shape and color of their skulls, and also to their skin tone, which again, that's not science, right? That's kind of personal preference. There's really no science here, but Blumenbach is playing it off as science, and people are going to accept that. He also goes on to say that physical beauty should be associated, or is associated, with morals and intelligence, meaning that the more beautiful you were, the more intelligent you would be. So if you were a member of one of his races that was not seen as beautiful, then therefore you would also be immoral and you would be unintelligent. And that's just not science either. And that's just not true. But these guys are going to produce these theories, and they're going to write these books, and it's going to have a major impact. Blumenbach's quote-unquote science will have a significant impact on how European and Western people perceive race. Blumenbach's bias and his research will be taught and reinforced in colleges and universities. So when you go to school, this is what you read, and this is what you learn, and this is what you believe, and this is what you begin to pass on. So these are very, very dangerous ideas that are not rooted in science at all. They're rooted in personal biases and what is called pseudoscience or fake science. Another person that contributed to this was Petrus Camper, who published the works of the late Professor Camper in 1794. It was actually published after his death, obviously. He was a Dutch artist and professor of anatomy, and what he's going to do is he's going to actually measure the facial angles of different skulls, which is called prognathism, or prognathism. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce that. Down in the bottom right corner of the screen, you can see actually a chart of his, which we'll talk a little bit more about here in a minute. So he's an artist and professor of anatomy. So what he decides to do is he decides to determine what is the most beautiful, or who has been the most beautiful people in the world. So he has determined from his own point of view that the Greeks and the Romans, but predominantly the Romans, were the most beautiful people in the world. And there's not really any original Romans walking around anymore. There's not any OG Romans. So he goes and he takes these marble statues that are left over from the Romans, and he measures their facial angles, he measures their nose and their forehead, and the distance between their eyes and ears and jawline and all these things, and he comes up with somewhere between 85 and 100 degrees, right? Oh, wow, 100, that's a really good number. That's kind of like a perfect number. So then as he's measuring the skulls of people from different parts of the world, Europeans, based on his measurements, averaged around 90 degrees. African skulls, which he measured, are going to average around 70 degrees. So again, he is going to do what Blumenbach did, and he's going to create a chart or a list and create a hierarchy. So Camper's theory, and again, this is really bad science, Camper theorized that the closer a race was to 100 degrees, the more ideal they were in terms of physical beauty. And like Blumenbach, he's also going to infer that these physical beauties also indicate your moral or intelligence, so that your morals and your intelligence is associated with your physical beauty. These ideas will influence and reinforce prejudices and racism, and people are going to continue to build on these ideas. So Blumenbach and Camper's ideas kind of lay the groundwork, and then people are going to add to them. Science historian John Haler concluded that the facial angle was the most extensively elaborated and artlessly abused criteria for racial somatology. This is not real, this is fake, but people bought into this and people believed it, especially people who were European, because they're at the top. According to both of these European scientists, Europeans were at the top, and people like to hear that, right? So it all kind of makes sense. Camper also would measure skulls and measure the brain cap in the skull. And he manipulated his experiments to get the results that he wanted. He would fill them up with peppercorns and then count or weigh the peppercorns as they filled in the skull. And the more peppercorns, the bigger your skull. Therefore, the bigger your brain. We've since learned that that's not true. But he would manipulate those experiments to get lower numbers for non-European skulls. So again, their science is completely 100% flawed, but people believed in this science at the time, and that's very, very dangerous. Immanuel Kant, who was my model for our Mapping the Enlightenment presentation, he is also going to have some very strong ideas about people's races. So in his philosophy, he's going to write and talk about this hierarchy of the races, which he listed as white Europeans, yellow Asians, black Africans, and red Amerindians, which is a term that was used back then for Native American Indians. He describes the yellow, Negro, and copper red races as having increasingly serious deficits compared to whites, and as lacking the capacity to govern themselves. So he did not believe that people who were non-white Europeans were able to self-govern, were able to create their own societies and cultures and communities where they could actually govern themselves. Kant had some very, very, very strong racial opinions early on in his career. He said, quote, "Americans and Negroes cannot govern themselves, thus they serve only as slaves." He said, "Whites contain all the impulses of nature and effects and passions, all talents, all dispositions to culture and civilization, and can as readily obey as govern. They are the only ones who always advance to perfection." He said, "The Negro can be disciplined and cultivated, but is never generally civilized. He falls off his own accord into savagery." And that Native Americans are, quote, "far below the Negro, who undoubtedly holds the lowest of all remaining levels by which we designate the different races." Now, these are some very, very, very strong ideas and beliefs that are completely racist in their origin, completely biased, and completely prejudiced. But because Kant said them and people respect all the other things that he says and does, people are going to believe this. So these powerful ideas, as wrong as they are going to have consequences. People are going to believe them. What about women? Because we're going to talk about women here in a moment. While we're on Kant, let's talk about the things he said about women who are going to also be treated pretty poorly and their gender be stereotyped pretty significantly. He said, scholarly women use their books somewhat like their watch. That is, they carry one so that it will be seen that they have one, though it is usually not running or not set by the sun. So he's talking about intelligent women who carrying around books is someone like wearing a watch. We just want people to see we have one, but it's not really running, meaning that women are just pretending to be smart. He said, the greatest obstacle that prevents the male sex from returning to a state of happy simplicity is the female sex, meaning that men are not happy because women are around. The virtue of a woman is a beautiful virtue. That of the male sex ought to be a noble virtue. Women will avoid evil not because it is unjust, but because it is ugly. Women were supposed to be beautiful at all times, and they will avoid anything that makes them look ugly. They do something only because they love to, and the art lies in making sure that they love only what is good. I hardly believe that the fair sex is capable of principles, meaning that women don't really have principles or values or ethics or any of those things. So these are all pretty harsh things to say about the female gender. So these Enlightenment thinkers are, really well known for these really amazing ideas, but that doesn't mean that they're not without their faults. John Locke, whose ideas are going to inspire the American Revolution and help write the Constitution, essentially, also had some conflicting ideas about slavery and about women. Locke had some very differing opinions on slavery. He actually supported the enslavement of people as the result of a just war. So in his theories, he said, if one nation conquers another, then the conquering nation can and is rightful to enslave those people. He also invested quite heavily in the Royal African Company and the Bahama Adventures Company, which bought and sold and transported slaves. But he also wrote about life, liberty, and property, and all men are born free and equal. So there are definitely some conflictions there. To Locke, slavery, is a complicated situation where on the one side he's saying one thing, but on the other side he's kind of acting in a different way. In terms of women, Locke noted that women were subordinate to men, but that it was not their destiny, that women were, subordinate, which means they have to obey men for now, but at some point they'll probably overcome that. He said that the idea that man was superior to women was invented by man, so therefore it was reversible, that the idea of man and women being unequal was not natural, that men and women being born in a natural state meant that they should be equal. And he said, quote, the biblical Adam did not have a private dominion over the world, but shared it with Eve. So as a religious man, he references Adam and Eve as being equals in the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis in the Bible. So therefore, men should not treat women like this. But again, here's a guy that people respected and liked and read and followed, and he's got some conflicting ideas about race and gender. So does Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau wrote that it was part of nature for women to obey men. So his view of nature was a little bit different than Locke's, who said that, man and women were together and should be equal. Rousseau says, women do wrong to complain of the inequality of man-made laws. When she tries to usurp our rights, she is our inferior. Wow, he just straight up said inferior right there. And then he said, men and women are not equal. It is the part of one to be active and strong, the other to be passive and weak. Woman is intended to please man, and their education must be wholly directed to give them pleasure and to be useful to them. So women were born to please man and to serve man, and that they are not equal, according to Rousseau. And Antoine Leonard Thomas said, because of their delicate natures and natural modesty, women are less able than men to feel and express strong emotions, to excel in intellectual pursuits, or to create great art. They are by nature inferior to and dependent upon men, and their primary function is to serve as wives and mothers. They should therefore be excluded from the public sphere and be educated only for a domestic role. Wow, that is pretty harsh right there from Mr. Thomas. And that's basically the type of life that women were expected to lead at this time in history. Women did not have equal access to education and jobs and wages and freedom and legal rights in most places in the world. And it's because of things like this, those things will continue. So the Enlightenment ideas are going to have power and influence. The positive, great discoveries of political thought and scientific discovery are going to help change the world, but that's not to say that the Enlightenment was without its bad ideas. Ideas about race and gender and servitude and what we should expect of people based on where they're from in the world. These are all powerful ideas that are going to carry on for a very, very, very long time. And these ideas are going to be very difficult to break and to convince people that they're just simply not true. So we can celebrate all the great achievements of the Enlightenment, but we do need to recognize the Enlightenment had its dark side, and some of this really bad science and philosophy is going to have major consequences for racial and gender issues.